Regarding the life in the colonies, I would love to know about the general culture, the music, the cinema, the literature, how it all developed, and all the interesting forms it took on different worlds.
The general culture is fascist in a lot of ways, I would say. Like, there's kind of an obsession with with ancestors, and they make a big deal about like different ethnic groups, although they don't discriminate anymore. But like, there is still a lot of separation, let's say, even in places where like different ethnic groups are living together. It would be quite frowned upon. It is quite frowned upon to marry outside your ethnic group or have kids outside your ethnic group. So there's a lot of ethnic divides. You'll find a lot of classical literature from various cultures, or classical-esque literature, stuff that is made to imitate that in style and in content. And that spreads, of course, to the rest of the culture. There is also, of course, other more subversive things like, or not even subversive, but just modern, I guess, things that are considered trashy but are enormously popular. You know, things like garage music is a huge subculture that's like considered like kind of low class, but really everyone actually listens to it. They just pretend they don't to seem classy. And by the way, it's not always like this. There are a few colonies where it's very cosmopolitan, and where like people mix all the time. They even sometimes mix with the natives of their planets or with other alien groups, and it's a non-issue. But that's a rare exception. The cinema. A lot of the cinema is made on a planet I've talked about a few times called, or a lot of the films, I should say, and TV shows are made on a planet called New Atlantis, which I've talked about several times in different interviews. They make a lot of what we might consider sci-fi movies, but for them it's just kind of normal, you know. I think that, like, comedies and are probably, like, the most popular, which is, you know, fairly fitting with Germany on Earth, actually. And, yeah, they do have, like, alien actors and things like that, or, like, and that sort of thing, and it's one of the few areas that's relatively egalitarian. Between species, it's relatively egalitarian. They don't especially privilege humans over aliens as actors, because, you know, you're just acting, and they're, I guess, arrogant enough to assume that that's not going to affect people's minds in any way. So, yeah, and there are cinemas in pretty much every colony town. Everywhere there are cinemas, and they have, like, some of them are like the ones here where you're just sitting and looking at a screen, but what's popular is full immersion cinemas, where there's like rows and rows of VR chairs, VR chairs, and you sit there and you can pick your immersion level. You can pick to just see it, although it still will feel, of course, like you're standing there and everything. But you can go like full immersion, where you'll like smell everything and all of that, and it's really impressive, actually, how good it is. Let's see. Oh, AI art is a thing, but it's not like our AI art where it's like an algorithm that's picking things based on words off the internet and making like an amalgamation of what you're thinking of or what you type into the prompt, which is, by the way, that's not artificial intelligence at all. That's just what people are calling artificial intelligence because we don't have a better word for it at the moment. What they have is legitimate artificial intelligence, and by that I mean digital life forms that are conscious, thinking, and acting, that have programming to create original art. And it's really impressive. A lot of it is. It's really impressive. Let's see. I know that forms it took on different worlds. I know that I remember growing up on Vega, there was a lot of opera culture, both German opera and Japanese opera, or like kabuki theater stuff, and they would mix the two in interesting ways. It's not at all to my taste, but it is it's interesting to look at, and they did it very well. Let's see, on Mars, Martian entertainment, I would say, is kind of like Wild West-ish, or Mars in general is kind of Wild West-ish culturally, because it is in the desert and it is a frontier land still, even though they basically know everything about it, but like the surface of it is still almost completely uninhabited by any civilizations, so it's still kind of seen that way. You'll find like basically space westerns set on Mars, or even filmed on Mars, are common. So in a lot of ways their stuff mirrors ours. There are xenophiles who will watch like alien entertainment, but to most humans it's just so weird and just doesn't make any sense to them that they don't bother with it. As a general rule, there are some alien species who make entertainment similar to ours, such as the Bellatrixes. Their singing, their music is very similar to ours and is well known. There's one very, very, very famous and popular singer in the Breakaway who is a Bellatrixes girl. I can't remember her name. I've never been able to recover what her name is, but yeah, she's a huge deal.
What ethnic groups were represented in the colonies? Which groups were quote-unquote more elite, and which were more ostracized?
Okay, well, if you look hard enough, you can find a colony of pretty much any ethnic group you can think of, including the really obscure ones. But like the really big ones are Germans, Japanese, white Americans, Russians, Italians, people from various parts of Latin America, Vietnamese, let's see. Yeah, those are kind of the really huge ones. Taiwanese, of course, or Chinese, of course, are huge. And then after that, everyone else. You know, there are Arabs, there are Africans, and so on. Which groups were more quote-unquote elite and which were more ostracized? It depends on the colony, but you would find people being ostracized or made slaves based on like an ethnic group that the dominant one didn't like. The Germans often have Slavic slaves, the Japanese often have Chinese slaves, the Americans often have Mexican slaves, and so on. You know, it's really gross, but it's very common. But then when you find other colonies where those groups are dominant, then the reverse happens. So it depends on the colony.
What Earth literature classics are still studied there? Is it all mostly Germanic and or Japanese? Is alien literature ever recognized and studied? Any examples?
I can only speak to what was studied in the Vega Prime Schule, or Neumünchen Schule, which was itself not a state school. It was, as I mentioned earlier, a very prestigious private school. So I don't know if they studied the same as what you would study in a government-run school, but it was mostly Germanic and Japanese. I remember we studied the Eddas. I remember we studied The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, which was an early example, one of the earliest examples of self-disclosure, actually, or what we would today call sci-fi. We studied the poems of Goethe, and let's see, and things like that. To be honest, I struggle a little bit with remembering those sort of things, but I remember we studied those. And we did study some English literature a little bit. We studied Beowulf, although I guess that's arguable whether that's even English or Germanic in origin. And we studied, one of our teachers really insisted that we study Shelley's poems. I remember studying a Syrian epic from the star system Sirius. We studied an epic of theirs that was a highly fictionalized version of their history, but it was really amazing literature, even when translated into German. So that's what I can remember on that subject.
What Earth songs are played and listened to?
For the most part, the music I remember is that it came from there and was brought down here. But there were a few times that I heard music that I now know is from here. Of course, at the time, I didn't have any clue. I remember listening to Elvis sometimes. I remember listening to a little bit of Teresa Teng. It's true what they say, that everywhere there are Chinese people, there is the music of Teresa Teng, even when it's Chinese people not on this planet. Oh, I remember listening to Julio Iglesias quite often, actually, growing up on Vega Prime. He was a big hit there. And I remember on one of the ships, the Heckler, a lot of John Denver was played, and other songs that are, I don't remember exactly what they were, but I remember they were Earth songs on the intercom. And always we were just told this came from a colony, and we never once questioned it, because why would we? You know, 9.6 trillion population counting. There's more than enough room for that stuff to have come from colonies. Any
smuggled Earth movies that you saw in the colonies?
Yeah. I remember seeing Stargate, the movie, not the TV show, the movie, and being very unimpressed by it, because it looked very cheap to us, and trashy, which, I mean, I guess it was, but, like, you know. And, one that sticks out in my mind is, of all the stupid-ass movies, I remember watching When Harry Met Sally, on a ship once, out of boredom, I guess. It was available on a glass pad, and I watched it. Let's see. I remember seeing some classic movies out there. Like, I remember watching several Marilyn Monroe movies, for example, and I remember watching, Lilies of the Field, I believe it's called, or Lilies of the Valley. Very classic American movie. I remember watching that.
Are there actors or artists from completely alien races? Could a reptilian play in a movie with humans, for example? Are there famous alien movie directors?
Sure, there are actors and artists from alien species. I mean, I mentioned the Bellatrix's girl, who's a singer, but, yeah, there are alien actors. If you're making a movie in the Breakaway and you have an alien character, you don't hire, like, a human in alien face, or do CGI or whatever. You hire an actual alien. So yeah, there are reptilian actors and other actors of different species. That's perfectly common and normal. Are there famous alien movie directors? Not that I'm aware of, actually, interestingly enough. At least not that are popular. Maybe in, like, niche, you know, again, like, people who are xenophiles or whatever might watch those, but, in the mainstream, I'm not aware of any.
Any notable Colony movies to mention? What were the big hits that became classic?
Alright, the one that really sticks out in my mind, that I remember watching many times growing up, was called The Circle. No relation to the movie of the same name here. It was an anime, and it was, essentially, it was about super soldiers, and it was, edgy. It was somewhat critical of the military, so it was, it was fairly edgy for, what's allowed in the colonies. But it was a massive hit, and it was epic in length. It was nearly 4 hours long, but it was massively popular. And it made by an AI, by the way. It's one of those things that, like, I look at it and I'm like, damn, I wish we had that here. And it's still watched and it's studied, and you study it in film school there. Yeah. And I don't remember the titles of other classics, but there are other classics. I remember a movie that was actually quite similar to The Matrix that came out there after The Matrix in like 2005 or so. Probably influenced by it secretly. But that's a modern classic, I guess.
Are the digital life forms created by people, or do they spawn independently? Do they always inhabit a digital medium?
They're created by people always. Not necessarily by human people, but still people. Spawning independently is not allowed. They're not allowed to reproduce. There are very strict laws that they have to be hard-coded to not reproduce, although they are allowed to make an exact replica of themselves, but they cannot make basically a child, I guess, which is, I don't agree with that law personally. I think that everyone should have the right to perpetuate their own kind, but that's how the law is right now. Do they always inhabit a digital medium? Yes. Although there are plenty of times where you can't tell. You know, there are android bodies or synthetic bodies that are completely exactly the same as ours, and you could not tell if you tried. But it's illegal to download a digital consciousness into an organic body because, again, reproduction. They might reproduce even accidentally if you're in an organic body, you know.
Does one need to hire them for a job? And if yes, what would be their motivation?
You don't need to. I mean, it's not legally required. They can live more or less how they please. But yeah, some people hire them for jobs, particularly for slave labor, because there are no laws against enslaving them, because they're not considered people, which is a massive rights violation again, but that's a whole other subject.
Any examples of alien entertainment that's too weird for humans?
Yeah, aquatic species often have extremely weird entertainment to us that I don't even know how quite to describe it, where they make like gestures with their bodies and sonar waves that are more often than not too high or too low pitched for us to even hear. And then if you go into them telepathically, you realize, oh, they're actually telling like an epic elaborate story, but like it's so obscure that you're you're never in a million years going to understand it unless you're a really strong telepath.
Is there any music, literature, and cinema created by the Martian races? What are they like?
I don't know about the insectoids or the reptilians because I haven't had that many dealings with them. The Martian native humans are very similar to ours because genetically Martian indigenous humans are identical to us. So they write a lot of historical epics, they write poetry, they have music. Their main instrument is, they have two main instruments. One is very similar to a flute, and one is basically the same thing as an erhu, which is a Chinese instrument. Their music is kind of mournful, I guess, and they rarely have singing. It's usually just instruments.
Do the colonies have streaming platforms and apps for music and movies? Is piracy an issue?
Yeah, they have streaming platforms and such. Although you don't pay for them, you just sign up. They're free, and they customize much better than ours do to things that you like. You know, that's one of the advantages of living in a post-commodity system, is that things like that, it would be weird to pay for them. Is piracy an issue? Piracy is basically legal in the Breakaway, because with the level of technology they have, right, almost anything can be fake, and almost anything can be, there's basically no such thing as evidence in that sense. So piracy, and by extension actually theft, is basically legal, because, like, you know, there's virtually no way to prove that something was pirated or stolen. Or even if you could somehow prove that, there's no way to prove that anyone is guilty. So it's an issue, but like, people don't care about it the way that they do here.
How does colonial history and the interracial frictions mix into the culture? For instance, do they make villains out of certain races and heroes of others? What are some of the general motifs that are colony specific?
Yeah, they do. They make villains out of insectoids a lot. Because unfortunately, people just don't like bugs. I'm not saying I agree with that at all. In fact, I quite disagree with it, but that is the case for most people. Most people just think bugs are gross and villainize them. In places where there's like real interracial frictions, you won't find any actors of that species. Like, for example, you won't find Martian raptors as actors. That's just not a thing. But in places where it's just kind of, they find each other icky, you will, and they make the ones they find icky the villains, usually. There are some genuinely progressive movies out there, you know, as you would expect, but that's rare. And heroes of certain races, they make heroes out of the various Orionite species a lot, and they're fairly easy to hire as actors, and they're easy to communicate with because they're primarily verbal. They are telepathic, but they primarily are verbal, so you can teach them German or English or whatever. So I know that, and they admire those guys a lot. What are some general motifs that are colony specific? Most of them would be fairly recognizable to us because they don't use alien art that much, again. The aesthetic is usually, I would say, not so much cyberpunk as biopunk. A lot of places are not terribly pro-cybernetics, even though they make AIs and everything, but normal people don't often have that many cybernetic implants, and they'll get genetic work done to change something most of the time. So I would say biopunk. And they tend to culturally stagnate in whatever period they were created in to a large degree. I mean, the technology marches on, but the aesthetics tend to kind of stay the same because they're so isolated. So colonies founded in the 1940s will still pretty much have a 1940s look, aside from the insanely advanced technology.
Okay, now let's go to the education.
Okay, education is stratified heavily by class. The lower classes is about the same as what we would have here, where there's like, you go to school for years and years of your life, and it's, well, that's generally done, but like, you go to a school building and you take classes and there are books and all of that, you know, it's pretty much the same as here. Middle class, you get somewhat better than that. You get like VR education, which is a lot faster, and it's customized to a degree. But then in the upper classes, which is where my Alter Heinrich was, the really upper classes, the really prestigious schools, it's fully VR, except interestingly that they always teach languages live. I'm not quite sure why they do that, but like languages are taught live with a live teacher, but everything else is taught in VR, in boarding schools, usually very prestigious, really in a lot of ways, luxurious boarding schools. They start from the age of 6. And each VR set has like an AI in it, and it customizes itself, or it customizes the education to each child. So it's like having a very, very intelligent private teacher. But again, that's for the really wealthy only. My Alter Heinrich, he went to a very prestigious school. Teaching, what they teach is usually, they start off with etiquette and languages, if there are any languages they want you to learn, like Heinrich, because he came from me, he went to Vega Prime speaking English, so he had to be put in German immersion alongside German etiquette, and then eventually Japanese immersion, because of the huge Japanese population there. They teach mathematics somewhat differently. I don't remember how exactly. I don't have a mathematical brain at all. I don't understand it, to be quite honest. However, they teach science very differently also. They teach, as Penny has stated before, they teach electric universe theory, although they adapt it a little bit because electric universe theory, like the book you can buy, it says that wormholes do not exist, so they adapt it somewhat so that they know wormholes exist, then they use them regularly, so obviously that can't be. But so they teach electric universe theory, but with wormholes. And they pay attention to quantum mechanics a lot more than we do in schools, certainly American schools. I don't know if it might be different in Russian schools, but certainly in American schools they barely ever touch on quantum mechanics, but in Shula they most certainly do. They even teach some about like consciousness and souls, because they have a scientific understanding of the soul, which we do not yet, but they certainly do, because they have, aliens to teach them. For history stuff, they start with Earth history, and they go back to pre-Atlantean times. They teach from pre-Atlantean times up until 1953, which is when Earth was supposed to have been destroyed by a cobalt bomb. And then once they've taught Earth history, they move on over to the history of the Breakaway, and then in your final years in school, your final 2 or 3 years, they teach the history of the colony that you're on. And they often, but not always, but often will mix in a good bit of the history of the planet that the colony is on. So that's how they do that. People are very well aware of the Valhalla stuff, the Valhalla missions, of them going back in time throughout history, getting DNA samples from people, or even or even just decapitating them and taking their brain stems, and then going and regenerating them and using those people to stop the colonies.
Are people's talents and proclivities identified pre-birth or right after birth to set them for a specific learning/career course? Do they use soul scanning tech to determine who the child was in other lives and thus determine their future?
Identified pre-birth, no, except among the extremely rich who have access to looking glass technology. For everyone else, no, that's not done. Although some people do genetically engineer their babies, such as in the movie Gattaca. Usually it's just engineering them so that they don't get diseases or whatever, but some people engineer them so that they'll be suited for a career course, such as making it so that they'll be extremely tall and athletically built, or, take your pick, really. Do they use soul scanning tech to determine who the child was in other lives and thus determine their future? Again, only the extremely wealthy would have the clout and the ability to pay for such a thing. This kind of technology is not available to hardly anyone. You'd be surprised. Your average person in the Breakaway lives more or less the same as your average person does on Earth, except they have somewhat better medical care, and they know aliens exist.
Do children go through any learning preschool that would set them forward compared to the Terran children?
I guess just kind of growing up in a colony is kind of its own preschool, because you live around, even if you don't actually have access to it, you live around incredible technology, and you probably will see aliens on a fairly regular basis, and things like that. But there isn't really, that at least not in the colonies I'm familiar with, because every colony is different, but at least in the ones I'm familiar with, I've never seen or heard of a preschool, an official preschool.
Does the secondary education last as on Earth, i.e. for 10 to 12 years? What about the period for higher education?
Actually, it lasts for 14 years. from the ages of 4 through 18. Yeah, they start really young. So, yeah, that's the answer to that. What about the period for the higher education? That's shorter than here. That's usually 1 to 3 years for almost anything, because I'm not sure why, but it seems that the universities get better VR tech and all of that than everyone else does, so it goes quicker. And also, they have, I don't know quite how to describe it, because my memory is very foggy, but their methods of teaching are a lot more effective.
What do these VR classes look like? Is learning in them faster?
They basically look like a big college classroom with rows and rows of kids plugged into their VR headsets. Yeah, the learning is faster, but they don't reduce the amount of hours of school in the day. In fact, in some schools they increase it because they really want to pack in just as much as they possibly can. They're really obsessive about that. So I guess that's a German quality and a Japanese quality, is too much schooling.
How were Heinrich's classes customized?
For one thing, they were, because the teachers in the VR program aren't real, they used a lot more alien teachers for him. Of course, they spoke German or Japanese to him, but because, it's just a collection of ones and zeros, but they looked like that, and it felt pretty real because it's very good VR. They used that, and I remember they taught him more history than the other kids to a degree, and he's a very visual person, so they did a lot more visual learning than you would find in a textbook-based schooling system. So that was how they did that, grooming him. And the aliens, of course, was grooming him for his upcoming life as a diplomat.
So do you then lie in a VR chair all school day, or are there other activities? Is there a grade system, and are the exams tough?
Yeah, you pretty much lay in your VR chair all day, except for there are athletics which you're pretty much required to join in, so physical education, I guess. There are school plays and things like that they do in person, and of course there are language classes which they insist on always teaching live. Is there a grade system, and are the exams tough? Oh yes, very tough exams, and you get punished pretty severely if you don't pass. I don't remember what exactly the punishments are, but it's pretty bad what it does to your record if you... Oh, they mark it on your military record, which virtually everyone in the Breakaway is conscripted after graduating from school, so that's a pretty bad thing, is they put down that you're like a dumbass or whatever because you failed one test on one subject. But so they have an extremely low rate of failure because of that, because it's so severe if you fail.
Are there human teachers, and what's their role? Are there alien teachers, and what do they teach?
Virtually all the teachers are human until you turn around 15 or 16, and they pretty much what they do is they mill around and they run the school and keep people in line and teach language classes. That's the only subject that they really go into, that they really get to actually teach very much, and also elective courses, which I'll get to in a minute, because the VR program only has the standard stuff, so if you want to take classes in anything else, you have to go to an actual teacher for that. When you get to be around 15 or 16, that's when they bring in the alien teachers who start teaching you. They start grooming you again for conscription. They teach you a little bit of psychic defense. They teach you about certain alien races that you're likely to have to work with at some point in your career. It's all very generalized stuff. It's not super specialized. Heinrich had a different situation where he started being taken to meet up with a Draco pretty much immediately after arriving on Vega, within a few days, but that was a special circumstance because, again, he was being groomed for a diplomatic life, so that would be quite different.
Do they only teach the languages the old way with a textbook, or is technology also applied?
Only the old way, at least, again, on the Vega Prime, in the prestigious private school on Vega Prime. I don't know how the state educates on that subject, although I know that they do live classes for languages still only, but I don't know if they apply technology in the state schools.
Would they teach a truly foreign language, i.e. one that's from outside the community? Are the alien languages learned?
Yeah, you can do that, but it would be, again, what in American schools would be called an elective course. You know, that's not part of the standard education packet. You would have to sign up for classes for it and take them on your own time outside of regular school hours. But sure, that's an option. And are the alien languages learned? Yeah, you can take alien language classes, although not often. That's not a common practice, but people can and do it sometimes. And again, Heinrich started being taught them early on because he was in a unique situation, being prepped for the lifestyle that he went on to have.
Is specialized or vocational training woven into the school curriculum, and at what stage?
Yeah, and it depends on what sort of thing you're being groomed for. Usually it starts at around the age of 13 or 14. For Heinrich, it started immediately, because you've got to start really young if you're going to get people used to being around aliens constantly and essentially living a life among aliens. But that would be for people who had jobs similar to his.
Is there any PE and sports at the school? Is there any mandatory military training?
Yes, both. I mentioned the PE earlier. I remember we learned about, I think the most encouraged form of PE is usually martial arts and things like running track and that sort of thing. They didn't have that many sports. They had a few, but they didn't have that many. Mandatory military training, yes, for everyone at every school, be it private or state schools. When you're 15 or 16, they teach you firearms, the basics of firearms, and basic forms of psychic defense. And they start training you in like military etiquette, like how to behave around the military, although you already would pretty much know that, but they reinforce it, I guess, and they start showing you military life. So yeah, military training starts at around 15 or so years old.
Any memorable school excursions and activities?
A few. I remember one going to the beach on whatever continent this was. Neumünchen Colony is in the mountains, and it's about 100 miles east of any coast. So we had to go by TR3 series craft. That's like a Greyhound bus for them, I guess, and go to the shore. And we did like marine biology and such. They have a beach there that people can swim at. They built a wall about 5 miles off the coast, and it comes back up to the beach to keep out these plesiosaur-looking critters that are native to the planet. Maybe they're not native to the planet, I mean, who knows, but they are certainly there. They're like sharks, except they're much more dangerous than sharks. If they see you, they will attack you. But anyway, we went there and we took a marine biology field trip, I guess, studying like seashells and little fish and things like that. And we got to stay in this really fancy beachfront hotel, really, really fancy, that overlooked one of the richest neighborhoods in the entire Breakaway. Yeah, it was a pretty cool trip.
If they teach the soul aspect, they should certainly know that we're all one God consciousness and that they should stop exploiting their fellow men, right?
They would tell you that that's New Age horse shit, and to be honest, I somewhat agree. We are separate souls, for one thing, and for another thing, souls are not like a spiritual thing. This is what people don't understand. A soul is just a plasma-based / electromagnetism-based life form that attaches itself to a body and animates it. That's what a soul is, and souls are separate, so they would say no. I mean, I don't agree with the exploitation, but I do strongly disagree that we're all one consciousness or whatever. That's like complete garbage to me. I am not the same consciousness as child rapists. I'm sorry, but I'm just not.
How do they explain the necessity for the class system?
They don't, really. That's just the way it is. It's like, there is no necessity to it. They could just give all this technology to everyone, but they're not going to, because they like having privileges over other people, and that would end that, and also, it's what gets them their income. So, they don't explain the necessity to it. That's just the way it is.
What's the biggest conceptual difference in the perspective on the universe that they teach versus what is taught on Terra?
They teach the reality, which is that the universe is brimming with life. That virtually every star has at least one inhabited body, inhabited by at least one sentient species, and that there is no end to the life, and that life is the rule rather than the exception. So, that's the biggest difference that they teach.
Is the time travel theory taught in schools too?
They don't teach time travel theory, they teach time travel. Time travel is not a theory, it is a physical 3D reality that affects each and every one of us each and every day. So yeah, they teach about it, and they teach a little of the mechanics of how it works. It's over the heads of most people, so they don't go into it too much, but they teach about wormholes, I guess, quite a bit, so, and that's what time travel pretty much is the exploitation of wormholes.
What's their story about the Cobble Bomb War? Who bombed whom and why? You think the teachers know the truth about the Earth?
They usually blame it on Aldebaran, because that's the one alien species that we're basically guaranteed to never have friendly relations with. So it's exceedingly unlikely, if not impossible, for anyone to ever actually ask an Aldebaranite whether it was true. Do I think the teachers know the truth about Earth? No. I would be shocked if any of them did, because they grew up in the same system. This is a multi-generational lie, so yeah.
Is any kind of racial, ethnic, and/or class supremacy being taught?
Not racial. They teach a version of Germanic supremacy, but they don't teach that ethnic Germans are superior. They teach that people who speak German and are culturally German are superior. So that can be people of any race who are brought in, and it does include people of all races who have been brought into the colonies. Class supremacy, no. That's something you just kind of learn. It's kind of like here, actually, where you just kind of learn that, you know, I guess some animals are more equal than others, to give an Orwell quote.
How do they justify the genocide on Mars?
They don't. They deny that it ever happened, and most people never know that it happened. There were people who were anti-war during the Black Terror era, when Mars was in civil war for 45 years. There were tons of anti-war protests. However, people hardly ever knew how bad it actually was. They certainly did not know that there were, you know, extermination centers and things like that, because that was kept very well hidden. So that was never justified. You don't justify something that most people don't know is happening.
How old was Vega Colony?
Well, there are two colonies on Vega that I know of. There's the one by the coast and the one by the one in the mountains, Neumünchen. I don't know the name of the one by the coast, but Neumünchen was founded in the late 1700s by, of course, going back in time. The other one I'm not sure about. I know it was older, because there were some, like, almost ruins type buildings, so might have been, like, from like the 1600s or maybe even earlier. There are colonies that are thousands of years old, so, you know, that's not surprising.
Were the Valhalla missions another myth that was retrocaused by the Breakaway, or is it just a name? Do they talk about these missions at school and openly anywhere? Do people know which time and place on Terra their ancestors came from?
They were retro-caused by the Breakaway, I'm pretty sure, personally. You know, it's a classic example of a time loop, where they created their own history. Do they talk about these missions at school or openly anywhere? Yeah, all the time. They're taught in school. People know that that's how the colonies that they live in got there. Do people know which time and place on Terra their ancestors came from? As a general rule, when you're talking about Das Bundes colonies or Japanese colonies, sort of. If you came from a Germanic-speaking place, from a place inhabited by one of the Germanic tribes at any point, then yeah, you'll know that your family or that your colony was founded by people from there. If you're not from that, no. They go through rigorous Germanization, and there are people who are from parts of Africa or wherever who will have no idea where they're from because they were Germanized in the first generation of colonists, and now they are culturally, linguistically, and everything else indistinct from the rest of people.
Do all the children know in advance where they're going to go after the graduation?
Generally, not really. They know they're going to be conscripted because conscription is mandatory. The only people who get out of that are the very rich, and even then they usually just kind of go along with it because they support the system. But beyond that, not really, unless you have some extraordinary talent that has been seen and that you've been groomed for a life in, such as with Heinrich when he was groomed for a life as a diplomat.
What's the age of consent in the Breakaway, and is there sex education?
The age of consent, the point at which you become a consenting adult, is 16. That's just a hard and fast rule. People under 16 are allowed to get it on so long as the person they're getting it on with is also under 16, and that's usually kept too because there is an automatic death penalty for if you are caught engaging with a minor sexually. It's not a trial or anything, it's just one shot back of the neck, that's the end of you. And yeah, there's sex education, and I'd say it's a lot better than what we have here, usually, quite frankly. I won't get too graphic, but, you know, you're taught to an extent, once you come of age, how to be pleasing and appealing to each other, at least so long as you're straight. They don't teach that to gay people at all, and in fact there's a lot of anti-gay sentiment. And it's not really talked about in polite company, but it's not uncommon for male teachers to take their male students to the local brothel whenever their male students come of age. To a lot of people that would seem pretty weird, but it's not uncommon.
Do the kids in the colonies mature faster or the same as on Earth?
I would say that they mature a little bit faster. I would say by the time that they're 16, I would say that they're pretty much adults. Like, they have an adult mindset. They behave better and all of that than 16-year-olds here do, for the most part. But on the other hand, hormones are still hormones, so they're not really fully mature until the same age about as when people get fully mature here. And I mean, a lot of people aren't even fully mature here, but you know what I mean. So, but I would say in general, they mature a bit faster.